A very good afternoon. Hello, hello, hello. Sorry. Check, 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 check. You've got a couple of mics there, or you have? You have a very good afternoon to everyone who has assembled for this session. Very good afternoon to Stephen and Deborah. It's a great privilege to be joined on stage by you. And thanks, of course, to the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet for thinking up of this session, which looks back at Mallory's expedition of 1924. Um, I mean, George Mallory, I think, is a name that is familiar to many of us, not least because of his iconic sort of response to a journalist who had asked him, "Why do you want to climb the Everest?" And he had said, "Because it's there." Right? And of course, he attempted to climb Everest a couple of times at least, and the 1924 was a fateful expedition. Um, the last that was probably seen of him was by the co-mountaineer, I mean, one of their teammates, Noel Odell, who said that he had spotted two dark specks of black climbing towards the peak. And it tantalizes us to this day as to whether Mallory and Irving did indeed reach the peak, or whether they 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 were, they met their end before doing so. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll start with the discussion, which looks back not just at Mallory and Irvin's climb, I mean their entire team's efforts from 1924, but at the kind of journey that Mount Everest has had in the public imagination, in the imagination of mountaineers and writers over the last 100 years. So, my first question is to Deborah, which is that, in The Last Englishman, you write about a pamphlet inside John Auden's trunk, right, which is the cinematograph record of the 1922 climb, and which he had picked up after a lecture by George Mallory. And you write that after the Great War, there was hope. I quote, that by reaching the summit of a traumatized nation would find the perfect Englishman, and through him, the perfect means to memorialize all lives lost. So, this is in the aftermath of the First World War, of course. Would you say that the generation of mountaineers, cartographers, geographers about whom you write, which includes Eric Shipton, John Auden, and Michael Spender, would you say that they drew inspiration from Mallory? And do you think that over the years, the way they perceived this challenge marks any significant change from the way Mallory, Irvin, and those of his generation perceived it? So,
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to say it's really lovely to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's a real honor. This book was published a few years ago. So it was wonderful to have an opportunity to revisit these questions. First of all, I'm not a mountaineer. You know, when I first started, I would constantly confuse Edmund Hillary with Mallory. Um, and so it was a new world for me. And I mostly write about these two Himalayan explorers, both of whom were sort of scientifically inclined, John Auden and Michael Spender, the older brothers of W.H. Auden and Phil. God, no, that was his son, Stephen Spender. Um, and yes, I do think that Mallory's expedition, 1924 expedition, was closely followed by John Auden, and I'm sure Michael Spender. He visited a lot of public schools, and he visited Oxford and Cambridge, which both had mountaineering clubs. And he was a inspiration, and he ended up, being martyred like so many were of his generation. But I do think that the generation that followed, the generation of climbers, mountaineers, and scientists that approached Everest in the 30s, there were five failed expeditions to Mount Everest in the 30s, had a different understanding of what they were there to do. They were less interested in, revisiting the trauma of the First World War. They had a very, you know, they believed that, science and the technology that they brought to the high Himalayas would help them succeed where others had failed. And they also, the British government through the Royal Geographic Society had very much identified the quest for the summit of Everest with the effort to hold on to power over India. So in that sense, I don't think that was at all in Mallory's imagination, um, you know, uh, at all. But and it wasn't really in John Auden's. John Auden's main driving interest in being included on these expeditions was to try and understand, how these mountains got there, how they, how, he grew up in, exploring the Lake District and the sort of more gentle hills of England. And the colossalness, which is something he registered in this short little film clip from the 22 expedition, just blew him away. So as a geologist, he wanted to understand what kinds of earthly forces could create something like that, like like the high Himalayas. And as for Michael Spender, he was a, fanatical map maker and cartographer, and he'd worked in the Alps with Swiss map makers when they were redoing the major mountains of the Alps that, alpine mountaineers like to climb. So he liked the challenge of, triangulating and getting all the equipment in the right place and finding the right angles and to capture these for maps. And all of this kinds of technology would then be eventually repurposed for the Second World War.
So that's really fascinating. Thank you so much for taking us through that, because the way you kind of connect these lives and to the kind of social milieu that existed in not just Calcutta but also with Delhi, because there's some sort of there are two mountaineering clubs that are coming up, right? And then they kind of coalesce, and that's how they start with the expeditions, particularly John Auden. I mean, it's something. Yeah, and you're right. It's really good that we are getting to revisit that, because your book came out in 2018 or so, I think, right? So it's wonderful to go back to it 5 years down the line. And the next question for me would be, I'll put this to Stephen, which is, in your book, Becoming a Mountain, there's this passage that I found really moving, where you say, and I quote, "Healing is a journey like any other, a slow, solitary quest leading towards a distant, unattainable summit. Your body is a map with routes sketched out in veins and arteries, with mountains and valleys of muscle and bone. Walking these trails, you grow stronger." You've written so powerfully about how the mountains were a means and a source of healing for you. But what I was also wondering is how the mountains themselves map differently onto the human body and the psyche, in the sense that people seem to respond to different heights in different ways. I mean, in some ways, your perception changes when you reach at the top, you're low on oxygen, it works differently lower down. um, and also when you look at it as something which is symbolic of the sublime, and as opposed to that, say, when you're looking, as you do in your later work, which is more at the flora and fauna, which is a much closer look at the natural ecosystem of the mountains, particularly of Everest. I was wondering, do you think that over the years your perspectives have changed in terms of the lenses through which you've uh, understood the mountain, read it, walked it, climbed it, and so on?
Yes, well, thank you, Sujaan, for the question, and it's a question that I could probably take a couple of hours to answer, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. But first of all, my thanks again to the Kolkata Literary Meet and to the organizers for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. The quote that you read is really in reference to a personal journey of healing, which is at the heart of becoming a mountain, where my wife and I were attacked, and then uh, there was a physical process of healing that went through, and part of that was walking through the mountains and connecting with the mountains physically. Uh, but I think that it's also very important to recognize, as Deborah mentioned, that those early expeditions that Mallory was on and Noel Odell and the whole cast of characters were there were very much a project in healing too, because they were coming out of the trenches of the First World War, having witnessed horrific events, terrible violence. It was really the first fully mechanized war there was, and it devastated a whole generation. So then what happens is when the armistice occurs, these men are sort of cut loose from that violence and, in a sense, cut adrift. And there's a wonderful book called Into the Silence by Wade Davis, which really takes this story from start to finish. And it's if you want to read one book on Everest, I would recommend Into the Silence. And he talks about the way in which these Everest expeditions became for the British and for the Australians and others who had fought with them, in a sense, a search for redemption, sense of searching for some sort of meaning out of that horror of war. And Mallory is very much a part of that thing. I mean, he's a central figure. He becomes central to the narrative. 1921 is the first uh, expedition. 1922, 23 there wasn't an expedition, and then 24 is there. And as I read Wade Davis's book, and as I've read other books from that period, what strikes me is that Everest is really, in all its different facets, a truly modern epic, and an epic that has different narratives from the geological, the scientific on so many levels, cartographic, political. I mean, remember, Everest is not in British India. Everest is on the edge of Nepal and Tibet. So they had to get permission from the Dalai Lama. Charles Bell is up there negotiating permission to enter. And how do they enter? They go through Darjeeling, across the Natula, into the Chumbi Valley, and then they have to trek all the way up to the Rongbuk Glacier. A tremendous expedition in and of itself. The Tibetans, after 24, forbid entry. The Ranas in Nepal have not allowed anybody to go up into Nepal also. So there's all of this political story. And I won't get into all of that, but each of these layers of that epic are fascinating. And at the end of it, what is probably the most fascinating are the personal vignettes. And I'll just share two, if I may. Um, Teddy Norton, who was a lieutenant colonel in the in the Indian Army, uh, sort of your caricature of a British officer in India. He was stationed in Meerut. He was a pig sticker, all of those sort of things. He is on these expeditions and ultimately becomes the leader of the 1924 expedition. But Teddy Norton is also an artist. And there's a wonderful book that his son brought out just a few years ago of the watercolors that he painted while he was on the mountain. So here he is up. At that point, he made it up above 8,500 meters, which is the highest anybody had gone, 4 days before Mallory disappeared. But he was up there with his paint box. And remember, for watercolors, you have to have, of course, water. But how do you get that water under freezing conditions? It has to be melted. And there's a wonderful description in that book of Teddy Norton up there, and they're beautiful watercolors. They really are spectacular. When he's painting, he has to position his paper in the sun. because if his shadow falls on the paper, his brush freezes. So you have these moments of just absolutely, I mean, it's that sort of epiphany in a sense when I read that. It was so magical, as against, of course, these expeditions are military expeditions. I mean, it's the command structure, everything is what these guys brought from the trenches. I'll share another anecdote later, but I won't continue at this point. Thank you.
Sure. No, I mean, if you wish to, or we can come back to it as well. But
Well, very briefly, the other, there's so many fascinating characters, but as I was telling Deborah earlier, one that I find particularly interesting and moving is James Morris. And James Morris, as a young man, is on the not the 24 expedition, I think the 22 expedition, as the correspondent from the Times in London. And he shares a tent with Mallory at that time. And so he's sending back dispatches to London about these expeditions. And that's, I mean, one of the things you have to remember about mountaineering is one sport that has no audience. So you have to create an audience by sending these news dispatches back. And then once you go, you give your talks and your slideshows and all of that. So James Morris is sending these dispatches back that are being eagerly read in London, and it's creating that narrative. In 1953, he's there with the expedition that put Tenzing and Hillary on the summit as well. And he's the person who sends a runner down from Camp 2 to Namche Bazaar, and that gets sent to London at the time of the coronation, and it's there. So James Morris is both. He's there in this world that is an entirely masculine world, entirely masculine. And yet in 1970, he goes through a gender reassignment operation and becomes Jan Morris, the author that all of us have, not all of us, but most of us have probably been familiar with, who wrote wonderful histories of the colonial period, travel books, and things like that. And so you have this person who lived with Everest throughout his and her life. And I remember just before she died, she had written a piece, I think in The Guardian, complaining about the commercialization of Everest. She must have been in her 90s at that point, and saying that, these commercial expeditions have taken away the spirit of Everest. So individuals like that. I'm sorry, I've rambled on far too long.
no, thank you so much. And in fact, these are things that we will return to over the course of our conversation. Um, I think the next question is sort of, I mean, it's an open-ended one, and it's something that that either or both of you may wish to address in your own ways. Um, Deborah, in The Last Englishman, you mentioned this incident where Eric Shipton leaves behind someone on the north face, and the expedition carries on, and they're left behind. And you say that Tenzing Norgay disagreed with this attitude, and you say that Sherpas had been known to keep the dying company, even if it meant certain deaths. Stephen, in your chapter on Chomolungma's people, you refer to Sherry Ortner's remarkable book, Life and Death on Mount Everest, which is, in fact, again, a book that someone actually quite recently recommended to me, and I found it really sort of moving, because what it does, it tries to tell the Everest, or the story of, I mean, in this case specifically Everest, but to write mountains from the point of view of the Sherpa community as well. So and you also mentioned that in terms of Sherpa voices being heard or read, there are probably just the two autobiographies, one by Ang Tharke and the other is by Tenzing Norgay. So would you say that the relationship between the Sherpa community and the outsiders, as it were, which is pretty much anyone who I suppose is coming and attempting these sort of expeditions, do you think that this has evolved over the years? Have the attitudes changed? And do you think that there is adequate representation of the other side of the story, as it were? in the literature or in the sort of more general public discourse?
Well, again, it's a big question in that way, and I'll try to be brief. I think one of the fascinating things about the relationship between the Sherpa community and the climbers is that, in a sense, it was almost accidental,
Right.
because at the beginning of the 20th century, a number of Sherpas had migrated from Solukhumbu Valley. There wasn't much happening in the Solukhumbu Valley. That was all closed off to climbers. And you could be a yak herder, you might transport salt across the mountains, but there wasn't much. So many of them migrated to Darjeeling. And they were working as on daily wages in Darjeeling. So when these expeditions came, they turned to this community and other migrants from other parts of Nepal to support the expedition, because they had to haul this equipment all the way back to the Rongbuk Glacier. So they just happened to be in Darjeeling. And then over time, they developed a reputation for being excellent high altitude porters. The Himalayan Club had been formed by 1928, and they then established the Tiger Sherpas with their special badge, which recognized their abilities as mountaineers.
I see.
The answer to your question, has it been fully represented? No, I don't think so. But those two books that you referred to, the Memoir of a Sherpa and then Tenzing Norgay's Tiger of the Snows, the Memoir of the Sherpa has an account of this Shipton's party having left one of the Sherpas up on the North Col. What it was the Sherpa had a stroke.
I see.
Well above 7,000 feet. And he had completely lost control of his body. He was in and out of consciousness. The European climbers came down. Many of the Sherpas came down. And one Sherpa actually stayed. A young man named Ang Tharke. And he actually carried this man down to base camp. They were actually able to take him back to Darjeeling, and he died a few months after that, but he got home. And Ang Tharke himself, in that memoir, was quite critical of the expedition for having and his fellow Sherpas for having abandoned him. But of course, Ang Tharke really became famous when he had assisted Maurice Herzog to climb Annapurna. His memoir first came out in French, and I have a feeling the French also had their opinions about the British expedition. So we have to read it with a certain gloss.
Yeah.
But I hope that there will be more and more books, accounts coming out of the Sherpa community, analyzing that whole experience and looking forward into the future and
Yeah.
their relationship with Everest. I'm sorry, Deborah.
That's right. I just like to say that, like, when I was, recreating these climbs, in which included the Karakoram and Everest and other places, I was working with diaries, especially Michael Spender's diaries, and they were very exhaustive in terms of all the complaining about the food and the temperature and everything. He was really a brilliant complainer, but he also would talk about the his Sherpas a lot, and he would recount, their conversations and the way that they're, like, sometimes he didn't know where he should put the camp, and he would say, well, where do you think we should put the camp? And they would say, wherever you want to, even though, I mean, he was sort of kept being pushed into this position of authority that he didn't feel he had, or that they were the experts, but they didn't want to, take any responsibility. And also, he did this expedition in the Karakoram. Now, of course, the Karakoram is really far from Darjeeling, but they took these Sherpas all the way from Darjeeling to, what is now Pakistan, to help them um, get over into the glaciers where they were doing their surveying. And they had to hire a bunch of Baltis, and Baltis are not Sherpas. And he would write a lot about the different the ways in which the Sherpas and the Baltis engaged with each other, or, like the Baltis would dance around the fire at the night, and the Sherpas would be looking very skeptically at them. And, so you did have a sense of the kind of ethnography that was very different from, the relationships between the Pakisabs and the Sherpas. They began to understand each other. They understood each other a lot more than, say, the Baltis and the Mountaineers.
Sorry, just to go back to the point that you're making, I was wondering, so you mentioned Spender's, you were looking at his diaries, was it? So what were the kind of different sources that you found to piece together to recreate the narratives that you mentioned in terms of
Well,
Shipton?
yeah, it was diaries and letters, and of course Shipton and Tillman, they all wrote their books, and they had a certain voice that they used in their books. Shipton was, cheerful in the face of all kinds of disasters
Mhm.
and rebellions and insurgencies, and Tillman was very gruff, and Tillman was a veteran of the trenches, and I think he was in the mountains just as a kind of death wish, just, tempting fate at every opportunity. Um, but yeah, so I obviously use their account, but they have these perfect voices in their books, and
Mhm.
but the voices that they have in their letters are often very different.
I see, I see.
And what I appreciated about Michael was that, you weren't supposed to ever complain. And Michael was constantly complaining. And so it really gave you a sense of just how bloody awful it was.
Yeah, no, and I think particularly if we look at these sort of little moments of drama, moments of encounter, it really humanizes a lot of these stories, and you get a glimpse into, I mean, how dreadfully challenging it must be to, you know, be. I mean, it's quite unimaginable for someone like me who has never gone higher than Darjeeling or something. But
No, I think for even for those of us who have traveled through the mountains quite a bit, and I'm not a mountaineer, but I attempted mountaineering, and when I got up there, I realized this is the stupidest thing I have ever done in my life. I admire mountaineers enormously. I love the stories and all of that. But personally, I thought, why on earth am I doing this? Putting my life at risk, uncomfortable for days on end, and and yet there's a magic to it. And one more story, if I may tell.
please.
The third member of this trio of Shipton and Tillman is Frank Smythe, and Frank Smythe is quite a different kettle of fish in many ways. A slightly more romantic, slightly more poetic in his writing. He's the one I always appreciate his work perhaps more than the other two, though all three are ex- extremely readable. But Frank Smythe is up on Everest in the 30s, and I can't remember which expedition it is. And he and Shipton head up, and they're getting up well above 8,000 meters. And Shipton finally turns back because he's having trouble breathing and just can't make it. Frank Smythe goes on, and he describes what is an experience that many mountaineers have described, many explorers, sailors have described, which is the third man experience, having this presence with him on the mountain. And he's going up there all by himself. Shipton has turned back, and he's convinced that there's somebody with him. And you have to give him a little bit of poetic license. But when he writes about it, he describes how he finally sat down exhausted. He took out a Kendall mint cake, which is the sugar supply that all of these climbers had, and he offers part of that Kendall mint cake to the third man who is sitting there. And then at that point, he realizes he's not there. So there are those sort of moments that these guys describe. And they're storytellers. As I said, they come off the mountain, they have to captivate an audience in so many different ways. But I think to a certain extent, that experience of the third man is something that Shipton experienced it too. And it's one of those marvelous enigmas of high altitude exploration.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, of course, Odell went on to say that he saw these two specks climbing up, and you often wonder whether, I mean, how the mind bends at that altitude, along with the body itself. So no, I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And um, at I mean, in the 30s particularly. Deborah, I think in The Last Englishman, you seem to be very aware of the fact that, that there is a competitive spirit to this, to climbing Everest, to climbing higher and higher altitudes, which is taking place at an international level, right? And Stephen, you also mentioned this conversation with Shekhar Pathak of Pahad, where you ask him about the naming. Yes, Everest, Chomolungma, Sagarmatha. Sagarmatha. What and these seem to, suggest that Everest has been a site of some degree of contestation across the years in different ways. Um, so, do you think that it has ceased to be a site of contestation now, or and if so, what kinds of aspirations are projected onto it at the present moment, if at all, or is it purely a commercial thing? And yeah, I mean, and yeah.
Well, I think people are using Everest as a way of a personal branding. They're, uh, expanding their influence. They're, paying really good money. I think you said what, $150,000 is what it takes to get together an expedition. I think it
150,000 to get yourself hauled up to the top of the
right,
mountain.
right, okay, yeah. Um, and it's about empowerment, for women, for disabled people, for older people, for uh, causes. It's less national. It's less about planting a national flag um, than it is about, sort of personal or even corporate branding. I think it's become.
And I think the name, there's a wonderful irony in the name Everest in and of itself, because I think we all know the story that it was named after Sir George Everest, who took over the Great Trigonometrical Survey and became Survey General of India. Everest himself, according to John Kay in The Great Arc, Everest himself got very angry if somebody called him Everest. He was actually Everest, George Everest. And anytime anybody called him Everest, he would lose his temper. He was an appalling man. I mean, he was extremely
He lost his temper
ill-tempered
all the time.
all the time. He had terrible indigestion the entire time he was in India. So I suspect it was the amoeba and giardia that triggered it. But I think it's wonderful on one level that the mountain is a mispronunciation of his name. He would have hated it. But what I was talking with Shaker about is again the way in which these names uh, get attached to mountains and then detached from them. Chomolungma, of course, is the Tibetan and the Sherpa name for it. Sagarmatha is the current name in Nepal. Everest doesn't seem to go away. We can't get away from it in that way. And Shaker was basically he's a historian of the Himalaya. And what he was saying was there's a famous explorer named Nain Singh Rawat from Uttarakhand, from Garhwal. And there was a point at which there was a Nain Singh range or something that was named, but that at some point then was erased from the map. And the way in which these names, Godwin Austen was given to K2, and then it became K2, not Godwin Austen. We don't remember Godwin Austen, but Everest we do, or Everest, if we want to be polite to him.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, and from what I was reading, he also seemed to not have been very taken with the idea of naming the mountain after himself, right? I mean, there seems to be the work of this Stephen Waugh, who comes after him to the trigonometrical survey, who, after it's announced as the highest peak, they displace Kanchenjunga. Everest's measurements are finally published by the Royal Geographical Society, and then he names it after his predecessor at the trigonometric
That's very
survey.
possible.
So
I'm not entirely sure, but it sounds like
and
that would
and
be.
apparently he said that, and Everest himself is supposed to have preferred Chomolung, I mean, preferred a local name, and to which Waugh had responded that it was not known. Whereas, in fact, in a earlier French map, Chomolungma does appear. So there seems to be a great deal of, like you said, I mean, it's irony and confusion, but here we are. I mean, uh, and one final question, I think, before we open it out to the audience. Stephen, you, of course, over the years have looked very closely at the ecological side of it as well. So, a couple of sort of interrelated questions. What led you to that? I mean, what made you? I mean, where was the fascination with that? And what kind of awareness do you think your work can translate into in terms of policy or yeah?
Well, I'm not sure my work is going to contribute to it. But there are a lot of people who are working very hard at uh, trying to recover the uh, environmental. Uh, I wouldn't say purity of it, but Everest fundamentally had become a garbage dump, and there was an enormous amount of equipment littered everywhere, from base camp towards the summit. There was also an enormous amount of human excrement on that mountain as well. So many climbers now, both from Nepal and from other countries, from India as well, they, first of all, it's required that whatever you take up onto the mountain, you retrieve. But then there have been a number of Everest expeditions that were simply there to drag tons and tons of material off the mountain, and then it's brought down to base camp or down to base camp 2, and then helicopters will take it out and hopefully get rid of it in a responsible manner. But I think that effort uh, is working to a certain extent. There's certainly a consciousness in the mountaineering community that they cannot continue what was happening before. I'll add one thing. The interesting thing about it is also how it became an almost a cargo cult there in terms of and if you walk up to the uh, base camp and you stop at different tea stalls and rest houses, there will be jerry cans from the 1935 expedition. There will be somebody's boots. They will be on display. And Nile Chakravarti, who's the secretary of the Calcutta um, chapter of the Himalayan Club, who I met earlier today, was showing me a picture in the Planters Club in Darjeeling. There are two of Mallory's oxygen cylinders on display. So there is this sort of cargo cult to it as well, the relics of that period.
That's really fascinating, and thank you for bringing us back to Mallory as well through that. So, any last thoughts, comments that you would like to make, or we could, yeah, or we could also open it up.
I guess it's worth, thinking about, what will climbing Everest look like in 10 years, and what will be the ethos or the ethic of what will it mean? Now they're climbing Everest in the winter. You know, maybe, climate change will change all these things that we thought we knew about climbing and how to get up there and what it takes.
Well, and climate change is a big part of this story too. I mean, the reason they found Mallory's body ultimately was because the ice melted. And when Conrad Anker went in 96 and found the body and inspected it, it had been lying under the snow for years. So finally, those glaciers are revealing their secrets as they recede. So yes, I mean, the climate is a part of that epic, just like all of these other strands and episodes are.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Deborah, for really sort of stimulating discussion and illuminating for me as well, because I'm fairly new to this. So, in the last, I think we can take maybe a couple of questions from the audience.
And good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir. My question is linked with pop culture also, because we have seen in our latest movie called Everest, where Rob Hall's expedition team was shown. So we have seen how it has been commercialized, and as you were mentioning that for all purpose of reasons, like all reasons, people are going there. So, and we have seen in BBC and on multiple platforms where they have said the headline as traffic jam on Everest. So, what can be the policy intervention from the government which can actually weigh and then give the permission or the license and to even control that garbage dumping that's going on, to control that? And also, my second question is related to Mallory, that from these movies also we have learned a lot about balcony, Hillary step, like the process of going up to the Everest. But we don't know about Mallory's trajectory. So, like, there are still many conspiracy theories, and things are not very clear. So, if you can give some resources through which we can know further about it. Thank you.
Shall we collect a couple of questions and then respond to them, or would you like to? Shall we? Yeah.
One of the things, despite the strains in the Indo-China relations, one of the things that has worked seemingly unaffected by it is the Kailash Manasarovar Yatra, which continues to be a big revenue earner because the Chinese, irrespective of relations, always appreciate good business. Now that China happens to be everyone's favorite villain globally, and there would obviously be a rekindling of these conspiracy theories, as the gentleman mentioned. And when the climb up the northern ridge side is mentioned, the 1960 successful Chinese expedition will be under greater scrutiny as to whether they do have the Westpac Kodak, and as to what happened and whether they know the conclusion. So, depending on how China is targeted, or depending on how the Indo Chinese relations improve or deteriorate, do you think that's going to be the biggest factor when it comes to the human management of the Himalayan range? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's one question over there, but I think that's the last we can take for this session. Yes, please.
Thank you. The peak 14 of the Himalayan range was renamed Mount Everest. But the Everest peak was measured by Radhanath Shikdar. His name was never uttered by in any book or very little known to all. But the name was given to the Surveyor General, who was not even at that time when Radhanath Shikdar measured and published the height of the Everest. So, what is the background of this?
Shall I try
Sure,
that?
please.
Let me. We're both going to have trouble remembering all of your questions, but we will do our best in that process. Just the reference to Shikdar, he was one of the many what were referred to as the human computers used by the Survey of India. And literally, they were computing, they were doing the triangulation, and then the calculations would have to be done. And so he saw this mountain from the plains of Bihar on a very, very clear day, took the measurements, made the calculations, and that was the point at which Everest was then recognized as the highest mountain. So he has been mentioned. John Kay's books speak of him at some length. Until then, people used to think Nanda Devi was the highest. And in fact, Nanda Devi is number 23 on the list now. But at that point, Nanda Devi was the highest. But he was one of these, he was the first computer with obviously with a very active hard drive.
Second question was about Indo-China relations and whether that will have an impact on the human management aspect of it.
Well, I think wrapped up in that question is the idea of commercialization, and as you said, Deborah, what's the future and where is it headed? China certainly has opened up the North Face to a number of expeditions over the years. There are commercial expeditions going up from that side and from the Kangshung Face, which is the eastern side. So there are various routes. All of them have been pretty much climbed, alpine style winters ascents, all of that sort of thing. So now it's the paying basically what's you might refer to as high altitude tourism, essentially. And the Nepal government tries to regulate it. Attempts have been made, but nevertheless, there is a huge pressure from the commercial mountaineering companies to allow as many people as possible up on the mountain. And you never know. I mean, half of your clients may never make it above base camp. Uh, so calculating how many, then you suddenly get a window of clear weather. That's when these traffic jams occur because everybody heads up there. And then you have the disasters at that point. The Rob Hall, the film Into Thin Air, uh, sort of documents the opposite of that, which was a window that closed very quickly, and then the weather turned very bad, and it was catastrophic for everybody at that time. So, yeah, what you have to remember in all of this is that Everest is not something that can be managed or engineered. It's a natural phenomenon. And there are tremendous forces of nature at work up there, whether it's the wind, whether it's the snow, whether it's the temperatures are there. And it's not something like um, a cruise on the Nile that you can sort of predict in that way. So, yes, it needs to be regulated, but also we have to understand, I mean, the numbers have to be regulated, but we also have to understand that you're really not in control all of the time there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for responding to those questions. Um, Thanks once again to Stephen and Deborah for being um, for illuminating us on this matter and for taking us over 100 years in about 40 minutes, which is not an easy task by any means. Um, Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Now, there's just one quick announcement that yeah. So I'll just hand the mic to Shahana.
Before we end, we'd like to just have a formal book launch of Stephen's new book, The Cobra's Gaze. May I please request Ms. Deborah Baker to do the honors, please? And Sujaan, if you'd like to join them, it would be lovely.
This was even going to happen, but it's a delight and a pleasure to ask Deborah to launch this book, The Cobra's Gaze, which is just out. Just very briefly, it's a book about wildlife and wild places in different parts of India, and describes journeys that I took over the last 2 years to different wildlife sanctuaries and places like that. So it's a real pleasure. I'm seeing the book for the first time myself right now, so that's very exciting for me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.